I'm very happy to have this interview with my colleague Alex Schmid, who is a well-known author in the field of terrorism and counterterrorism. I think he needs no introduction. I could not even mention all the books, but maybe I want to mention one, and that's one of the latest books, and it's the Handbook on Terrorism Research. I think it's an excellent book if you want to have a comprehensive overview of the field of terrorism and counterterrorism studies. Well, one of the research he is well known for is his attempts to define terrorism. And my main question to you would be, why is it so important? I mean, you've devoted a lot of time into this question. Why is it so important that we need a definition of terrorism?
Well, there's a legal field where international treaties are made, cooperation takes place. Obviously, if some crime is outlawed in one country but not in the other, you have problems with rendition, extradition. So it's good that everybody is on the same plane. In academia, you have also a search for consensus among the different disciplines. I worked in both areas. I was, for instance, in 1992 asked by the UN Crime Commission to do a study on definitions of terrorism. At that time, the UN had already for 20 years sought in vain to reach a definition. And I came up with what I thought was cutting through the Gordian knot and saying, let's take a definition we all agree on, the one of war crimes, and stretch it. So I said an act of terrorism is the peacetime equivalent of a war crime, because taking of hostages, attacks on civilians, typically things that are war crimes are also crimes perpetrated by terrorists in peacetime. However, only India accepted that proposal. So
Well, I think that's more than 1 billion people. So in that sense, I wouldn't.
Okay, but one man, one vote, one state, one vote in the United Nations, whether it's India with more than 1 million people of Nauru with 10,000 or so. Anyway, I then refocused on the academic field and tried to create an academic consensus definition. I had already in the 1980s done 2 rounds of inquiry, and in 2011 I finished a 3rd one where I identified a dozen elements where there is a high degree of consensus in academia, and it's something that's in the Handbook of Terrorism Research.
It's also a definition we're going to use in the course, so these 12 elements are very important. I'm also very interested in what the participants in this course, who all have an interest in terrorism, what they have to say about that. It's really a very international group of people from India, Brazil, Russia, United States, Australia, Israel, Iran, etc. And of course we would be very interested to hear the opinion of these participants. But we'll come back to that later. You mentioned already a little bit about the obstacles, but what are the key obstacles? I can understand that number of states cannot agree on a definition, but why is it also in academia so difficult to come to a general accepted definition of terrorism?
There is interaction between academic discourse and policy discourse. It's a contested concepts in both fields, but more so in the political field. You know, they're saying one man's terrorist is the other man's freedom fighter. And Yasser Arafat, for instance, when he mounted the rostrum of the General Assembly of the United Nations, said freedom fighter can never be a terrorist. Of course, you can have several identities. Identity is a freedom fighter who fights for some goal, and terrorism is about the means. In my definition of terrorism, I distinguish between terrorism as a doctrine to a mode of fighting to bring about certain results, and terrorism as a practice by attacking civilians in order to create terror. So these distinctions play a role in politics and to a lesser extent in academia. But if you don't all sing from the same song sheet, then science cannot become cumulative. So it's important to have certain key terms, imperialism, radicalization, terrorism, well defined.
Yeah, and you tried in this article, in this research where you came up with these 12 elements. I'm very curious to hear about the way you came to these 12 elements. How did you manage to derive from all these different ideas of scholars? How did you derive at these 12 elements? What was your methodology? How did you manage to distinguish these 12 elements?
On the one hand, I looked through more than 250 existing definitions, starting from the French Revolution to 2011. And on the other hand, I looked at the historical development of terrorism, especially the type of insurgent terrorism that went under the name propaganda by the deed in the second half of the 19th
The
century.
anarchists.
The anarchists came up with that. That was a time when dynamite was invented. That was a time when the rotary press was invented. When the two came together, suddenly the violence part increased through the bombs, but the communication part of terrorism, and terrorism is a combination of violence and propaganda, increased tremendously. And now with rotary press, then radio, then TV, then satellite-linked television, and now the internet, the communication dimension has just gone up enormously. There was an old Chinese saying, kill one, frighten 10,000. Well, 10,000 was about the limit of those who could see the one killing. Yeah. But now the one killing can be seen by billions of people. So what terrorists want is attention, and building on attention they hope to get respect, and building on respect they hope to get legitimacy and ultimately power. So any attention seeker who engages in violence gets an audience because of the cooperation you have between media and terrorism. A colleague of mine, Brigitte Nakos, herself a journalist turned terrorism researcher, called the collaboration between the two, journalism and terrorism, strange bedfellows in a marriage of convenience, and that describes it quite well.
I think we can see that when looking, for instance, at the news of Boston, the media coverage is enormous. And in the end, it's just two boys who've done something. I mean, that mix is special, but not new. But you mentioned that there's a lot of new developments. Also, I guess that means that this definition here with the 12 elements requires also in the future really a re-investigation, as terrorism, of course, changing a lot. So with these 12 elements, we are very happy to ask also the participants of this course to have a look at it. This is the latest consensus-based definition, but we want to see and derive from mainly scholarly work, but we're very interested in your opinion as well as people that are interested in terrorism. Maybe some of you are professionals in the field of counterterrorism, so we want to know what's your opinion about the definition of terrorism, and we will ask that using your 12 elements of the definition as published in this book. So thank you very much for that, and I hope that you will find the results interesting and that we can build on your definition and your work in this very interesting handbook on terrorism research, which I can recommend. But you need a good shelves, because it's an enormous book with an enormous amount of knowledge. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.